problem of unemployment to fears of widespread hunger and starvation, and of course the social unrest that would accompany those things. Now, I mentioned Eloise earlier, and I want to consider it again as the absolute bottom of the safety net in Detroit. It's the last place that destitute older Detroiters could go to escape death from homelessness and starvation. The Department of Public Welfare had always referred clients who were unable to live independently to Eloise, but when the Depression hit, that trickle became a flood. Nearly 5,000 people were referred to Eloise by the department in 1930 alone. This photograph shows the front gate of Eloise in 1925. You can see it says Eloise there. This is Michigan Avenue. And this is the old infirmary building, so this is where the poor and infirm lived, and about 2/3 to 3/4 of the people who lived in that building were elderly. Now, Eloise was a fascinating institution. I could go on and on about Eloise because I was fascinated by the things that I found. It included not only the infirmary, but large general hospital, a psychiatric hospital, a tuberculosis sanitarium, and an extensive infrastructure of farms, shops, kitchens, bakeries, power and water plants, fire and police departments spread over 900 acres. It was a city in its own right, and it had its own post office and its own station on the Michigan Central Railroad. Because of its large psychiatric hospital, the stigma of insanity clung to the entire institution, which stained even the infirmary residents and contributed to its public reputation as a dreadful place, a place to be feared and avoided at all costs. Indeed, the Hannon case files are suffused with mentions of Eloise, mostly as a place that those applying for Hannon pensions were trying to avoid, or a place for whom those who were denied a pension were destined. The infirmary had about 2,000 what were called inmates at the time, before the Depression struck, but by 1933, there were nearly 14,000 people living in the Eloise Infirmary, most of them elderly. Despite constant building, the county was unable to keep up with the growth of the infirmary population, and overcrowding was a serious concern during these years. One of the most remarkable buildings built during this period was called Building N. It was over a quarter-mile long, and it had dozens of huge wards and the largest institutional kitchen in the world at the time. As an example, the coffee urn in its cafeteria held 200 gallons. It was renovated and enlarged several times immediately after it opened, and within a couple of years, there were over 7,400 people living in that single building. In fact, this building shows one of the many wards in Building N. And like I said, there were dozens of these wards, and you can see the bunk beds stretching practically to the horizon. Obviously, this would not be a good living situation for those who value privacy and control over their own lives, such as most of the Hannon clients. And perhaps as distressing for the former high society women who made up much of the Hannon clientele, they would be forced to bunk with foreign-born immigrants and people of color. There was no segregation within the institution. People with whom they presumably would not normally care to associate. On the other hand, when all else fails, one can certainly imagine a worse fate than going to live in Eloise with its clean sheets and medical care and hot meals. Here's what the historian of Eloise, who was a longtime employee of the institution, wrote of the infirmary residents in 1933. I'm just going to quote a bit here from what he wrote. Poor old men and women, bowed down beneath the weight of years, seek rest in our institution, where the cruel world can buffet them no more, where heartless sons and daughters can no more make the evening of their lives a bitter sorrow. What a blessing for those aged sufferers. There is such a place as the big Wayne County Infirmary, with a big-hearted county behind it. Shut out from the rest of the world, those destitute creatures with snow-white locks and faces deeply seamed with sadness and sorrow find at Eloise a release from contemptuous shrubs and the withering storm. Now, is it any wonder that President Franklin D. Roosevelt received such widespread support for his system of universal social insurance to protect against poverty and old age? Preventing an ignoble fate for the bulk of senior citizens and giving them freedom from the fear of ending up in a place like Eloise enabled millions of more Americans to grow old in a dignified and meaningful way. The environment I've described in Detroit during the Depression is the environment in which the Social Security system was developed and implemented. As Justice Cardozo wrote in his decision upholding the Social Security Act when its constitutionality was challenged, the primary purpose of the act was to save us all from the fear of the poorhouse in the waning years of our lives. I would argue that Social Security remains just as essential today, even after memories of such a fearful time have long since faded. Thank you.
So I'm Faith Hopp, and I've been asked to talk about the lessons we can learn from the Hannon visitors, who were among the very first geriatric social workers in the United States. As Tom mentioned, the Hannon visitors were experiencing the Great Depression along with everyone in Detroit. At the same time, the profession of social work was actually in its formative years during the Great Depression. As part of this, there were changes going on in prevailing beliefs about poverty. The early visitors were actually volunteers. They were not paid. And these were women, usually upper middle class and upper class women, who would literally visit the homes of people who were seen as being in need. And it was essentially moralizing. The visitors would be promoting what they saw as a morally upright lifestyle, generally avoiding as much as possible actually dispensing aid, and instead encouraging these individuals to live a morally upright and hardworking life according to the principles of the Protestant ethic and all that that entails. As the social work profession evolved, the visitors were, first of all, interested in actually getting paid. These were women who, and some would say that that we are still a little bit too close to being not paid at all. And the quest for professional status really began as part of this quest to become paid professionals on par with other professionals. And to give you a sense of this and what the early social workers were up against, I just want to read a small portion of a sentence from the chapter that I have written as part of the book. Abraham Flexner, in a famous speech to the National Conference of Charities and Corrections in 1915, asserted that social work was not a profession. I mean, imagine going to a professional conference of social workers and asserting that social work was not a profession. It takes a certain amount of gumption, I suppose, to do that. And he further claimed that social workers were simply acting as mediators between the real professionals, namely the physicians and the attorneys, and people in need. And I should note that our reading of the Hannon case file suggests that this depiction vastly underestimates the high level of knowledge, interpersonal skills, and diplomacies required by the visitors in their mediating role. Mary Richmond was a key player in the development of early social work and wrote one of the most famous of social work textbooks, Social Diagnosis, based on the idea, essentially partly in response to Abraham Flexner, and promoting social work as a scientific profession, meaning that social workers were visiting homes for the purpose of establishing essentially a scientific statement of the problem and thorough investigation according to systematic methods for determining the best course of action with which to proceed. And just to kind of follow up on Tom's notes about the overwhelming nature of the Great Depression, of course, the Depression had a direct impact on the visitors themselves. This is a quote, although men are now to be found more and more often in better paid jobs, the typical social worker is a devoted, hardworking, college-trained woman who has dedicated her life to the service of those afflicted in mind, body, and estate. Busy almost constantly, day and night, the social worker is valiantly trying to ease the suffering and despair of a few of the many caught in the utter breakdown of an industrial system. The truth is, the Depression has swamped social work. So the Depression had a direct impact on this young, developing profession. The one way of thinking about social workers during this era and also in the current era is to think of social workers as being what we might call, or what Lipsky might call, street-level workers. Street-level workers are those who interact with and have a lot of discretion over the dispensation of monies and other public services and sanctions. They set client expectations for services. They provide